It began with a sealed review inside Buckingham Palace, one so sensitive that even longtime aides were ordered to leave the corridor before the meeting concluded. But when King Charles emerged holding a red leather archive folder tied to Queen Elizabeth II's private diaries, the atmosphere inside the palace shifted instantly. Reports suggest the king had reached a devastating decision regarding Queen Camilla's access to one of the monarchy's most guarded collections, and insiders whisper the consequences were immediate. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What stunned palace insiders was not merely the existence of the review itself, but the speed with which everything around it reportedly changed. According to various interpretations circulating through royal administrative circles, the review had been ordered quietly weeks earlier after senior advisors raised concerns over archival access connected to Queen Elizabeth II's handwritten journals. These were not ordinary personal diaries. Palace historians have long described them as sacred historical material, collections believed to contain reflections on constitutional crises, family tensions, state affairs, and deeply private observations from the late Queen's 70-year reign. For decades, even senior members of the family reportedly approached the collection with extreme caution. But suddenly, that caution appeared to harden into outright restriction. Sources familiar with Buckingham Palace operations claim King Charles became increasingly unsettled after confidential discussions with trusted advisors revealed inconsistencies surrounding older access permissions tied to the archive. The concern, insiders whisper, was not simply about who viewed the material, but about how the monarchy's private history could potentially be interpreted during one of the most fragile periods the institution had faced in years. Charles, already carrying the physical and emotional strain of his ongoing health battle, reportedly viewed the issue through the lens of legacy. And that changed everything, because within the House of Windsor, legacy is never sentimental. It is power. It is survival. It is the invisible thread binding every generation of the crown together. Princess Anne, according to palace whispers, quickly emerged as one of the most influential voices during the review. Often described by insiders as the monarchy's iron-willed guardian, Anne reportedly insisted that Queen Elizabeth II's writings belonged not to individuals, but to the institution itself. Reports suggest she participated directly in examining outdated access arrangements connected to the archive, particularly permissions that may have remained active long after palace structures quietly shifted behind closed doors. Courtiers allegedly viewed Anne's involvement as a signal that the matter had escalated beyond a family disagreement and entered the territory of constitutional preservation. That realization reportedly sent a chill through senior royal households almost immediately. Then came the moment that transformed private concern into palace-wide alarm. Royal staff assigned to secure archival operations were reportedly seen removing restricted access keys from Clarence House offices under direct instruction following the review. The move was carried out discreetly, but not discreetly enough to avoid notice. Different interpretations of the incident spread rapidly through palace corridors. Some believed the decision was temporary, merely part of a confidential assessment process. Others feared it marked something far more serious, a deliberate effort to redraw invisible lines of authority around Queen Elizabeth II's personal legacy. And at the center of the storm stood Queen Camilla herself, reportedly blindsided by how quickly long-standing privileges appeared to vanish. For months, according to palace insiders, tensions had already been building quietly beneath the polished surface of royal life. Small disagreements over protocol, historical preservation, internal influence, and future legacy management allegedly accumulated behind closed doors while public appearances continued projecting unity. But the archive review reportedly exposed fears that had remained buried for years inside the institution. Fears about loyalty, about influence, about who might ultimately shape the story of the monarchy once Queen Elizabeth II's private reflections became part of royal history forever. And as whispers intensified across Buckingham Palace, It became increasingly clear this confrontation was never truly about paperwork or locked cabinets alone. But the decision was not simply about diaries, it was about control over the late Queen's private legacy, and who could still shape the monarchy from behind palace walls. For decades, Queen Elizabeth II's private journals were treated less like personal writings and more like constitutional relics carefully preserved inside restricted royal archives away from public eyes and even senior family members. Yet insiders now claim those same diaries suddenly became the center of a bitter internal struggle after concerns emerged about who had been reviewing sensitive material connected to the Queen's final years, including records tied to succession tensions and private family disputes. What made the situation especially explosive, according to palace whispers, was the sheer scale of the collection itself. The journals reportedly stretched across decades of royal history, documenting moments of triumph, grief, constitutional pressure, and deeply personal tensions that the public was never meant to fully understand. Some palace historians allegedly described the archive as one of the most sensitive collections in modern royal history because it did not merely record events, it captured the late Queen's private interpretations of them. And within the monarchy, interpretation can become far more dangerous than fact. A single reflection written behind closed doors could reshape how future generations understand loyalty, betrayal, and the fragile balance holding the crown together. Reports suggest the journals contained references to some of the most turbulent chapters of the royal family's modern era. Different interpretations from individuals familiar with archival procedures claim the writings touched on succession anxieties, internal protocol disputes, strained family dynamics, and emotional fractures hidden beneath decades of carefully maintained public composure. There were allegedly reflections connected to the fallout surrounding Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's departure from royal duties, concerns about preserving institutional stability during moments of public crisis, and private frustrations tied to growing tensions within senior royal households. None of this was ever expected to leave the protected silence of the archives. That was precisely why alarm began spreading when questions emerged over repeated requests to access portions of the material. At first, according to insiders, those concerns were quietly dismissed as routine archival procedures. But over time, senior courtiers reportedly began noticing patterns that unsettled them. Requests connected to sensitive records allegedly increased during a period when the monarchy was already navigating uncertainty surrounding King Charles's health, Prince William's expanding responsibilities, and ongoing public scrutiny of the family's future direction. Palace administrative staff reportedly became increasingly uncomfortable about who possessed clearance, who approved the permissions, and whether certain materials were being reviewed beyond their original constitutional purpose. The deeper officials looked, insiders claim, the more anxious the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace became. One palace historian allegedly warned that the journals could become historically explosive if handled recklessly or interpreted through personal agendas rather than institutional responsibility. That fear reportedly echoed through private meetings involving senior advisors, legal archivists, and members of the old royal guard, who viewed Queen Elizabeth II's writings as part of the crown's sacred inheritance. According to various interpretations circulating inside royal circles, the concern was never simply about public leaks. It was about influence, about narrative control, about whether fragments of the late Queen's private thoughts could someday be weaponized during future internal conflicts over legacy, succession, or reputation. And suddenly, the archive transformed from a historical treasure into the center of an invisible palace war. Prince William and Princess Anne reportedly emerged as two of the strongest supporters of tighter protections surrounding the collection. William, insiders whisper, viewed the preservation of Queen Elizabeth II's legacy as essential to safeguarding the monarchy's long-term stability, especially during a period of growing uncertainty around public trust. Anne, meanwhile, allegedly approached the matter with her trademark iron discipline, insisting that no individual, regardless of status, should possess unrestricted influence over materials tied so closely to constitutional history. Together, their position reportedly strengthened King Charles's resolve to authorize stricter oversight measures, even as tensions quietly deepened behind palace walls. And as scrutiny intensified behind palace doors, attention quietly shifted toward one question nobody inside the firm wanted publicly asked: why had access suddenly become such an urgent issue now? What appeared publicly as calm royal routine reportedly concealed a growing fracture deep inside the House of Windsor. Different interpretations of recent palace meetings suggest senior figures had become increasingly uneasy about influence, loyalty, and legacy as King Charles continued balancing royal duties alongside ongoing health concerns. And according to whispers from palace administrative circles, the diary review became the moment long simmering distrust could no longer remain hidden behind ceremonial smiles and carefully staged appearances. Behind the polished statements and carefully controlled appearances, reports suggest King Charles had become emotionally exhausted by the constant pressure surrounding the monarchy's future. Insiders whisper that the burden was no longer simply constitutional. It had become deeply personal. Every conversation reportedly carried tension. Every internal disagreement seemed tied to larger fears about stability, succession, and the fragile unity holding the institution together during one of its most uncertain chapters in decades. Those closest to the king allegedly noticed a growing weariness in him, not only from public responsibilities and health concerns, but from the realization that private fractures inside the family were becoming impossible to ignore. And nowhere was that tension more concentrated than around Queen Elizabeth II's private archives. According to various palace interpretations, the review process exposed divisions that had quietly existed for years beneath the surface of royal life. Princess Anne reportedly viewed the situation with increasing alarm, believing the monarchy's historical records should remain entirely protected from personal influence or emotional alliances. Sources familiar with internal discussions claim Anne warned that the late Queen's writings represented institutional memory, not family property. To her, the diaries were not sentimental keepsakes to be casually accessed behind closed doors. They were part of the constitutional spine of the crown itself. That belief reportedly hardened her stance during private meetings, placing her in direct alignment with those pushing for tighter archival safeguards. At the same time, whispers from palace corridors suggested growing unease surrounding the expanding influence of Camilla's inner circle. Some courtiers allegedly feared certain figures close to the Queen consort had become too embedded within sensitive administrative spaces tied to legacy management and royal preservation. Different interpretations of these concerns varied widely. Some insiders dismissed them as exaggerated anxiety fueled by institutional paranoia. Others believed they reflected something much deeper, a silent struggle over who would shape the monarchy's historical narrative once Queen Elizabeth II's private reflections eventually became part of royal history forever. And as those fears spread quietly through Buckingham Palace, suspicion reportedly followed every archival request, every confidential meeting, and every sudden procedural change. Prince William, according to insiders, became increasingly focused on what aides allegedly described as a legacy-first approach to royal preservation. Unlike older palace battles centered around popularity or public image, this conflict reportedly revolved around safeguarding continuity itself. William allegedly feared that private interpretations of sensitive royal material could someday deepen existing family fractures or create entirely new ones. Sources close to senior advisors claim he believed the monarchy could survive scandal, criticism, even public backlash, but conflicting narratives surrounding Queen Elizabeth II's private thoughts posed a far more dangerous threat. Because once history inside the House of Windsor becomes contested, trust inside the institution begins to erode from within. That fear reportedly haunted senior aides involved in the review. Palace administrative staff allegedly worried about the long-term consequences of future memoirs, leaks, selective disclosures, or competing interpretations tied to the Queen's final years. Some feared fragments of private material could someday emerge publicly stripped of context, reshaped into weapons during future family conflicts. Others believed the danger was not immediate exposure, but quiet manipulation behind the scenes, subtle influence over how the monarchy's past would eventually be remembered. And suddenly, the review process became symbolic of something far larger than restricted documents or archive permissions. It became a battle over memory itself, over authority, over who possessed the right to define the late Queen's enduring legacy. As tensions deepened, even routine palace interactions reportedly became strained with unspoken suspicion. Courtiers who once moved comfortably between royal households allegedly began choosing their words more carefully. Meetings grew shorter, trust grew thinner, and according to palace whispers, King Charles found himself trapped between personal loyalty and institutional duty, painfully aware that whichever path he chose would leave permanent scars behind palace walls. But while palace officials tried to contain the fallout quietly, reports suggest one final discovery during the review changed the king's position completely. Sources close to Buckingham Palace claim the atmosphere inside the private review chamber turned icy after a confidential briefing connected several disputed archive requests to highly restricted personal records belonging to Queen Elizabeth II. Whatever Charles reportedly saw in that moment appeared to trigger an immediate shift in tone. Insiders whisper that the king, once determined to avoid another internal royal confrontation, suddenly moved with what one palace figure described as cold constitutional clarity. Until that moment, reports suggest Charles had spent weeks attempting to contain the growing tensions quietly, hoping the review could remain an internal matter resolved through discretion rather than forceful intervention. Those close to palace operations claim he understood better than anyone how fragile the institution already felt. The monarchy was navigating uncertainty, public scrutiny, generational transition, and private emotional strain all at once. Another visible fracture inside the royal household was the last thing he reportedly wanted. But according to different interpretations circulating among senior aides, something uncovered during the final stages of the review fundamentally altered the king's perspective. The issue no longer appeared administrative. It became deeply personal. And more importantly, it became constitutional. Sources familiar with the review claim Charles reacted almost immediately after receiving the confidential briefing. Orders were reportedly issued behind closed doors suspending specific archive permissions tied to Queen Elizabeth II's restricted records pending further assessment. Palace staff allegedly received urgent directives clarifying who retained authority over sensitive archival access moving forward. What shocked insiders most was not simply the decision itself, but the speed with which the machinery of the monarchy began responding around it. Within hours, long-standing procedures were quietly rewritten. Internal clearances were allegedly reviewed. Security structures surrounding royal preservation materials reportedly shifted overnight with an efficiency that reminded veteran courtiers of older palace crisis operations rarely activated in modern times. Royal protection officers, according to whispers from administrative circles, were instructed to update internal archive protocols immediately following the king's decision. Some staff reportedly arrived the next morning to discover access systems altered without prior warning. Others allegedly learned through indirect channels that permissions connected to restricted collections had already been frozen pending review. Clarence House personnel were said to be especially blindsided by the sudden administrative changes. For years, relationships inside the royal household had operated through delicate balances of trust, influence, and proximity to the sovereign. But now, insiders claim that balance had been shattered by a growing realization that loyalty alone no longer guaranteed institutional access. Princess Anne and Prince Edward reportedly supported the decision privately, though neither was expected to publicly involve themselves in the controversy. Different interpretations from palace sources suggest both viewed the matter less as a family dispute and more as a necessary defense of constitutional continuity. Anne, in particular, allegedly believed hesitation would only deepen future instability. Insiders whisper that she warned the monarchy could not afford ambiguity surrounding Queen Elizabeth II's private legacy, especially during a period when every internal tension risked becoming public spectacle. Edward, often described by palace staff as cautious and deeply procedural, reportedly agreed that stronger safeguards had become unavoidable once concerns surrounding archival oversight reached the king directly. For Queen Camilla, however, the restriction order reportedly landed with devastating emotional force. Sources close to palace circles claim she was left deeply shaken by how rapidly events escalated once the review concluded. Some insiders believed she expected discussions, negotiations, perhaps even compromise. What she allegedly did not expect was the sudden institutional finality behind the king's response. Different interpretations describe an atmosphere of disbelief spreading quietly through parts of Clarence House as the implications became clear. Because inside the monarchy, revoked access is never merely logistical. It is symbolic. It sends a message about trust, about authority, about who remains inside the protected center of influence and who has suddenly found themselves standing further from it than ever before. Courtiers later described the atmosphere throughout Buckingham Palace as tense, but inevitable. There was reportedly little celebration, no sense of victory, only a heavy recognition that something irreversible had shifted inside the House of Windsor. Long-suppressed anxieties surrounding loyalty, preservation, and historical control had finally surfaced into the open, and many insiders feared the consequences were only beginning. Because once private tensions inside the monarchy cross the invisible threshold into institutional action, silence becomes far more difficult to maintain. Yet the revocation itself was only the beginning. Because the palace now faced a far greater danger, the possibility that buried royal tensions could spill into public view. As rumors spread through aristocratic circles and royal press networks, insiders began describing the situation not as a personal disagreement, but as a battle over the sacred geography of royal memory itself. Reports suggest senior palace figures feared that private interpretations of Queen Elizabeth II's thoughts, relationships, and final concerns could reshape public understanding of the monarchy for generations. And suddenly, the diary collection was no longer simply historical, it had become political. What intensified the anxiety inside Buckingham Palace was the growing realization that history itself had become part of the struggle. Royal historians reportedly warned senior officials that once private royal writings became vulnerable to competing interpretations, the monarchy risked opening wounds that might never fully close again. According to palace whispers, fears of factional divisions quietly spread behind closed doors as advisors worried different camps within the royal household could eventually shape entirely different narratives around Queen Elizabeth II's legacy. Some insiders allegedly believed this was no longer about archives alone. It was about control over memory, reputation, and the future identity of the crown itself. Prince William, according to various interpretations from royal insiders, became increasingly determined to protect the late Queen's image from any possibility of future controversy. Sources close to palace operations claim William viewed the preservation of Queen Elizabeth II's legacy as central to maintaining long-term trust in the monarchy, especially during a period already clouded by uncertainty and emotional strain. At the same time, frustration reportedly grew among figures aligned with Queen Camilla's circle, many of whom allegedly viewed the tightening restrictions as an institutional overreaction driven by fear rather than necessity. And caught in the middle stood King Charles himself, torn between personal loyalty and the crushing responsibility of safeguarding the institution his mother spent a lifetime protecting. It was Princess Anne, according to palace interpretations, who ultimately transformed the growing crisis into something far more structured and permanent. Known for her unwavering discipline and fierce devotion to duty, Anne reportedly believed the Queen's diaries were never meant to exist within the reach of personal influence or shifting family alliances. Insiders claim she moved swiftly after the review concluded, quietly helping establish stricter archival oversight procedures designed to eliminate future ambiguity surrounding access to the monarchy's most sensitive records. Prince Edward and senior royal legal advisors were also rumoured to be involved in reshaping internal protocols, with the effort framed privately as protecting the institution before personalities. As unusual archive security movements reportedly caught the attention of palace staff and royal correspondents alike, media speculation only intensified. Courtiers described Anne as the stabilising force behind the scenes, the figure willing to make difficult decisions while others struggled emotionally with the fallout. Charles reportedly accepted the measures despite the visible strain they placed on already fragile family relationships. But even as Buckingham Palace worked desperately to project calm and unity to the outside world, insiders quietly feared the emotional damage inside the royal household was only beginning to surface. Reports suggest the days following the revocation became some of the most isolating Queen Camilla had faced since entering the royal institution. Once viewed as the king's closest confidante inside palace operations, she now reportedly found herself increasingly separated from decisions involving royal preservation, legacy management, and internal historical archives. And according to insiders, the silence surrounding the issue may have hurt more than any official statement ever could. Behind palace walls, the atmosphere reportedly grew colder with each passing day. Sources close to royal operations claim Camilla quietly withdrew from several internal planning discussions after the archive restrictions were enforced, leaving longtime aides unsettled by the sudden shift in dynamics surrounding the Queen consort. Conversations that once flowed freely reportedly became cautious and restrained. Palace aides were allegedly instructed to avoid discussing the archive review publicly or even privately within administrative offices, creating an environment where silence itself became a form of pressure. And for many inside Clarence House, that silence reportedly felt far more devastating than open confrontation ever would have. Friends of Camilla, according to royal insiders, privately viewed the decision as deeply humiliating. Some allegedly believed she had become the symbolic casualty of a much larger institutional struggle unfolding behind closed doors. Others feared the restrictions sent an unmistakable signal that the balance of influence inside the monarchy had permanently shifted. But while frustration quietly spread through Camilla's circle, King Charles reportedly faced an emotional conflict of his own. Sources suggest he struggled to reconcile personal compassion for his wife, with the growing pressure from senior royal figures demanding stronger institutional safeguards around Queen Elizabeth II's legacy. It was a painful position for a monarch already carrying the physical strain of leadership during one of the most emotionally fragile chapters of his reign. At the same time, Prince William and Princess Anne reportedly remained focused almost entirely on continuity, stability, and long-term preservation. Insiders claim both believed the monarchy could not afford uncertainty surrounding the late Queen's private records, particularly during a period when public trust in royal unity already felt increasingly delicate. Anne allegedly continued pushing for stricter constitutional protections behind the scenes, while William reportedly viewed the situation as part of a broader responsibility to safeguard the institution for the next generation. And slowly, the conflict surrounding the diaries transformed into something far greater than a family dispute. It became a defining struggle over the monarchy's future identity. In the end, insiders whisper that this was never truly about access cards, locked archives, or even Queen Camilla herself. It was about Queen Elizabeth II's invisible authority continuing to shape the monarchy long after her passing. Because within Buckingham Palace, the late Queen's private writings reportedly remain more powerful than titles, more dangerous than public speeches, and more enduring than temporary alliances formed during moments of royal uncertainty. Palace figures allegedly believe the conflict permanently altered internal power dynamics, solidifying Anne's role as protector of constitutional continuity, while quietly positioning Prince William as the future guardian of royal legacy structures beyond Charles's reign. And although Buckingham Palace may never publicly confirm what truly happened during that private review, insiders believe one truth became impossible to ignore: the crown would always protect its legacy before protecting any individual within it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.